The morning sun barely seeped through the tall windows of courtroom 304 in the Philadelphia County Courthouse. It was 9:30 a.m. on a cold Tuesday morning, and Judge Marcus Sterling adjusted his black robe as he prepared for another day of cases. At 62 years old with gray hair and tired eyes, he had spent 25 years on the bench, believing he had seen it all. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activities. Low clerks rushed through the marble hallways with stacks of papers, while lawyers in expensive suits whispered to their clients. It was one of those days when every bench in the courtroom was occupied by people waiting for their cases to be called. Sarah Chun, Judge Sterling's clerk for the past 3 years, organized the day's files on his desk. She paused when she reached one particular case, frowning slightly as she noticed something. But before she could mention it, Judge Sterling waved her away. "Let's get started," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority he had cultivated over decades. The first few cases moved quickly and were typical morning matters of traffic violations and minor offenses. Judge Sterling received them with all the mechanical efficiency of a robot lawyer, seldom looking up from his papers. His reputation for being strict, especially with particular types of defendants, was well known throughout the Philadelphia legal community, though no one dared to discuss it openly. At 10:45 a.m., Sarah called the next case, docket number 2024, County Route 789, Commonwealth versus Dr. Maya Washington. A woman rose from the back of the courtroom. Dr. Maya Washington walked forward with quiet dignity, her steps measured and calm. She wore a navy blue business suit, her natural hair neatly styled, and carried herself with the composure of someone used to high-pressure situations. At 42, she had that sort of presence that usually commanded respect in whatever room she walked into, but Judge Sterling barely looked up. He shuffled through the papers, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. The charge was a traffic violation that had spiraled out of control after a series of unfortunate events. A missed court date because of an emergency surgery she had to perform, followed by a misunderstanding with a police officer. "Your Honor," began Thomas Reed, Dr. Washington's attorney, "my client is a respected neurosurgeon at Philadelphia General Hospital. The McCourt date was missed because of an emergency operation that couldn't wait. We have documentation." Judge Sterling cut him off with a wave of his hand. "The facts are simple, counselor. Your client failed to appear for a court date, and then argued with an officer of the law when he attempted to serve the bench warrant." Dr. Washington stood straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She had spent the last 18 hours performing 2 back-to-back brain surgeries, saving both patients' lives before coming directly to court. Exhaustion showed in the dark circles beneath her eyes, but her voice didn't shake. "Your Honor, if I may explain," she began, but Judge Sterling's sharp glance silenced her. "The time for explanations was at your original court date, Ms. Washington," he said, putting emphasis on the Ms. while ignoring her professional title. The corner of his mouth twitched down as he looked again at the file. In the gallery, several lawyers who had finished their own cases remained behind to watch, exchanging knowing glances. Anyone who had spent any amount of time in his courtroom knew Judge Sterling's patterns. Sarah Chun fidgeted at her desk, her fingers resting on the keyboard. Something in Dr. Washington's file had popped out at her, something big, but the dismissive way the judge was treating her made her keep her reservations silent. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Judge Sterling launched into his lecture. "This court's time is valuable, Miss Washington. Your disregard for the law and subsequent behavior toward law enforcement shows a pattern of disrespect for our legal system." Dr. Washington remained composed, though her attorney looked increasingly concerned. The original traffic violation, a disputed right turn at a yellow light, had somehow snowballed into something much more serious. Sarah finally worked up the courage to start writing a note. She knew what was coming next. She had seen it too many times before. But this time something was different. This time she knew something the judge didn't. As Judge Sterling prepared to announce his sentence, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds outside, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. No one in the room, least of all Judge Sterling and himself, realized that the next few moments would change everything. Judge Sterling cleared his throat, leaning forward in his high-backed chair. The fluorescent lights of courtroom 304 buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his stern face. Dr. Maya Washington stood perfectly still, her exhaustion from 18 hours of surgery hidden behind a mask of professional dignity. Miss Washington, Judge Sterling began purposely disregarding her title again. This court can't function if individuals choose to disregard its authority. His voice boomed through the now silent courtroom, where even the habitual rustling of papers had stopped. Sarah Chen's hand did shake a bit as she jotted down her remark. She knew she needed to intervene sooner. But years of practice in the courtroom held her back. Interrupting a judge during judgment was all but unprecedented. Your first crime was. Minor Judge Sterling carried on, his tone growing hard with every moment, but your subsequent actions show a disturbing disregard for law enforcement. In this court, he paused, peering over the top of his reading glasses at Dr. Washington. The gallery was becoming decidedly too full. The word had circulated through the courthouse about what was going on in courtroom 304, and several lawyers and court staff found reasons to hang around. They'd seen this pattern before. What starts as a minor traffic ticket escalates into much more. Thomas Reed, Dr. Washington's attorney rose quickly. Your Honor, if we may present evidence of the emergency surgery that had made Counselor. Judge Sterling cut him off sharply. You've had your chance to speak. The time for explanations has passed. His fingers drummed against his desk, a habit he displayed when his patients wore thin. Dr. Washington's shoulders remained straight, but her fingers tightened around each other. In her mind, she saw the faces of the two patients she'd saved last night, a teenage boy with a brain tumor and an elderly woman with a hemorrhage. Both would have died if she hadn't missed that court date. This court sentences you to 30 days in county jail, Judge Sterling announced, causing a collective gasp from the gallery, plus a fine of $5,000. And Your Honor, Sarah Chen's voice cut through the courtroom like a thunderbolt. In her 15 years as a court clerk, she had never interrupted a judge. Her hands shook as she rushed forward with her note, nearly tripping over her sensible shoes. Judge Sterling turned to her, his face flushing red at the interruption. Miss Chen, what is the meaning of? But Sarah had already placed the note in front of him. Her usual neat handwriting was hurried and urgent. Dr. Maya Washington, chief of neurosurgery at Philadelphia General, saved Emma's life last October. Your granddaughter's emergency surgery. The color drained from Judge Sterling's face as he read the note. His hands, usually so steady, began to shake slightly. He looked up at Dr. Washington, really seeing her for the first time that morning. Memories came with a rush. His 16-year-old granddaughter Emma, the terrifying phone call about her collapse at soccer practice, the desperate hours in the hospital waiting room. You remembered the surgeon who walked out at 3 a.m. Em was still wearing her scrubs to inform them that Emma was going to make a full recovery again. That same surgeon who was now standing before him inside his courtroom. Dr. Washington, he said softly, her proper title finally slipping off his lips. The inflection in his voice made everyone in the courtroom lean forward slightly. Dr. Washington met his gaze steadily. Yes, Your Honor, I remember Emma well. She had an arteriovenous malformation, a type of brain bleed. She's doing very well in her follow-up appointments. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy. Judge Sterling's hands moved to remove his reading glasses, revealing eyes that suddenly looked older, more troubled. The familiar walls of his prejudices began to crack, letting in uncomfortable rays of truth. Sarah Chen stepped back to her desk, her heart pounding. In the gallery, the watching lawyers exchanged meaningful glances. They all knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when justice, true justice, hung in the balance. Judge Sterling looked down at his sentencing notes, then back at Dr. Washington. His next words would either acknowledge his mistake or cement his prejudice. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in courtroom 304, as heavy as the morning air before a storm. For 30 long seconds, Judge Sterling sat completely still in his chair, his face a mixture of shock and realization. The only sound in courtroom 304 was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway outside. He remembered that terrible night, as she remembers like it was yesterday, when Emma, his beloved granddaughter, lay pale and unconscious on the hospital bed. Doctors telling him she needed an emergency brain surgery. Endless hours of waiting, praying, and hoping. And then Dr. Washington walking out of the operating room at 3 a.m., she was still in her surgical scrubs, informing them that Emma would live. Thomas Reed's soft voice cut through the gauzy veil of the judge's thoughts. Perhaps we can take a recess of a few minutes. Judge Sterling cleared his throat, his hands locked at the edge of his desk. Yes, 15-minute recess. It sounded different now, softer, uncertain. Dr. Washington remained in the courtroom as the courtroom emptied. Through whispers, court officers stood awkwardly by the doors, sensed at the unusual tension of the air. Sarah Chun buzzed herself as she was sorting papers, though her eyes kept darting between the judge and Dr. Washington. Once the courtroom was mostly empty, Judge Sterling stood up. He no longer looked like the stern, unyielding figure from just minutes ago. Instead, he seemed older, more human, more vulnerable. Dr. Washington, he began, stepping down from the bench. I owe you an apology, not just for today, but he paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to him. Would you join me in my chambers? Your attorney is welcome to accompany us. In the judge's chambers, the morning light filtered through Venetian blinds. She sends stripes of sunshine across the dark wooden desk. Family photos lined the shelves, including one of Emma at her recent soccer championship, alive and smiling because of the woman standing before him. Dr. Washington sat down, her posture still professional, but slightly more relaxed. The exhaustion of her long night of surgeries was more visible now in the natural light. Emma showed me her trophy last month during her final checkup, she said softly, nodding toward the soccer photo. She's made a remarkable recovery. Judge Sterling took the picture with shaking hands. She'd not be living today without you. He placed the frame down and turned to Dr. Washington squarely. And this morning, without even seeing you, right, I was prepared to commit you to jail. Thomas Reed sat there silently observing this bizarre sight. In his 20 years of being an attorney, he had never seen anything like this, Your Honor. Dr. Washington spoke slowly. What transpired this morning is greater than myself. It has to do with every man who walks through your court. The judge settled into his preside. Over the weight of her words hit him hard. The realization of how many others he might have judged in unfair proportion. How many times he allowed his prejudices to blind him from the human beings standing before him. Dr. Washington continued, I performed 2 emergency surgeries, one on a 17-year-old boy by the name of Marcus. The other was on a grandmother named Ruth. Both are alive this morning. That is why I missed my original court date 3 months ago. I was saving another life. Judge Sterling looked at the medical documentation on his desk that he had earlier refused to. A review of each page told a story of lives saved. Families kept whole because Dr. Washington put her patients first. Sarah Chun knocked softly and entered with a stack of files. Your Honor, I took the liberty of pulling some of your more recent cases. There's a pattern you might want to see. The judge nodded slowly, starting to understand the full scope of what this moment meant. His decisions hadn't just affected Dr. Washington. They had impacted countless lives over his years on the bench. The morning sun had fully risen now, filling the chamber with clear, unforgiving light. In that brightness, Judge Sterling could no longer hide from the truth about himself and his actions. The question was, what would he do with this revelation? Dr. Washington watched him carefully, seeing the internal struggle playing across his face. This moment could either be a real turning point or just another missed opportunity for change. The next few minutes would tell which path Judge Sterling would choose. That evening, Judge Marcus Sterling couldn't sleep. He sat in his home office, surrounded by law books and case files, with only a desk lamp lighting the room. The clock on the wall showed 11:45 p.m., but his mind kept drifting back to this morning's happenings in courtroom 304. There were 2 photographs on his desk. The first was a shot of his granddaughter Emma scoring a goal in her recent soccer game, something that never would have occurred if Dr. Washington hadn't saved her life. The second was a copy of Dr. Washington's medical credentials that Sarah Chun had printed out for him. Decades of education, countless lives saved, and numerous awards for her work in poor communities. Marcus, are you coming to bed? His wife Linda appeared in the doorway, wearing her blue robe. She knew that look on her husband's face when his world had been shaken. I almost sent her to jail, Linda, he said quietly, still staring at the photos. The same doctor who saved Emma's life. I didn't even look at her properly. I just saw. His voice trailed off, unable to finish the painful truth. Linda walked into the office and sat across from him. Tell me what happened, she said gently. So he did, starting with the morning's court session and ending with his shameful realization. Meanwhile, across town in Philadelphia General Hospital, Dr. Maya Washington was finishing yet another late shift. She stood at the nurse's station, updating patient charts, her mind occasionally drifting to that morning's events in court. Dr. Washington, a young resident, approached her. The family of Marcus Thompson, your surgery patient from last night, they wanted you to have this. He handed her a hand-drawn card covered in colorful crayon drawings. Opening it, She found a picture of herself, drawn by Marcus' little sister under his desk in shaky letters. It said, "Thank you for saving my Bach brother." The simple message brought tears to her eyes, reminding her why she had chosen this path despite all the obstacles. Back in his office, Judge Sterling began pulling files from his past cases. Sarah Chin's words about patterns haunted him. He started making notes, creating 2 columns on a legal pad. The evidence was becoming clear, and it made him sick too. His stomach. His phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Grandpa, Mom told me what happened today. Drive W is awesome, isn't she? She checks on me every time I have a follow-up. She even came to my soccer game last month." The judge's hands shook as he read the message. He remembered Dr. Washington's words from that morning. "What happened today is about more than just me." In her hospital office, Dr. Washington finally sat down after a shift in news. Alert popped up on her computer, another story about bias in the justice system. She thought about Judge Sterling's face when he finally recognized her, the moment when his carefully built walls began to crack. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph of her graduation day from medical school. She was the only black woman in her class. Her mother had told her that day, "Baby, you're not just becoming a doctor, you're going to be a mirror that shows people their own prejudices." At midnight, Judge Sterling was still awake. He got up to go to his kitchen for water and found Linda sitting there with 2 cups of tea. "Remember what my father used to say?" Linda asked, sliding a cup toward him. "The hardest person to judge fairly is yourself." The judge nodded, warming his hands around the cup. "I've spent 25 years on the bench, Linda. How many lives have I affected? How many Dr. Washingtons have stood before me, and I never saw them for who they really were." In the quiet of that late hour, both Judge Sterling and Dr. Washington, in their separate places, were thinking about change. The judge opened his laptop and began typing a letter to the State Judicial Review Board. Dr. Washington finished her patient notes and added one more thing to her schedule: a lecture on bias in healthcare and justice systems that she had been invited to speak. For the night grew darker, but for both of them, something new was dawning. Sometimes it takes a mirror to show us who we are, and sometimes that mirror comes in the form of a person whom we almost wronged. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a new day, and both the judge and the doctor would face their own reflections again. But this time, they were both a little more aware of how much weight their actions carried and how much power they possessed to create change. 1 week after the courtroom drama, Judge Sterling sat in his office, surrounded by towers of case files. His death calendar showed 7:30 a.m., but had been there since dawn. Sarah Chin stood nearby, adding another stack of folders to the already crowded space. "That's the last 5 years of cases, Your Honor," Sarah said, pointing to the colored tabs. She had organized red for harsh sentences, yellow for moderate, and green for lenient ones. The pattern was impossible to ignore. The red tabs appeared much more frequently on files of minority defendants. Judge Sterling picked up one of the red tag files. "James Carter, African-American, age 19, first defense shoplifting. I gave him 6 months." His voice grew heavy. "Next case, that same day, Michael Brooks, white, age 20, same charge, same circumstances, 3 months probation." Sarah watched as boss, once so certain of his judgments, now questioned every decision. The proud man who never admitted mistakes was gone, replaced by someone determined to face uncomfortable truths. Across town, Dr. Washington was giving her morning rounds at Philadelphia General Hospital. When her phone buzzed, there was an email from the State Judicial Review Board requesting her presence at a hearing. Judge Sterling had reported himself for bias in sentencing and listed her case as evidence. "Everything okay?" He drive W asked Jenny, her favorite nurse, noticing her surprised expression. "Yes," Dr. Washington replied, still staring at her phone. "Just unexpected news. Sometimes people can surprise you in good ways." Back in his chambers, Judge Sterling met with Judge Maria Rodriguez, a respected colleague known for her fair sentencing. She sat across from him, reviewing his findings. Marcus said, looking up from the papers, "What you're doing is brave, but it's also going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. Some of your colleagues want to thank you for shining this light on the system." Sterling nodded, remembering how he used to dismiss concerns about bias in the courts. "Maria, I've been wrong for so long. Last week I almost sent a brilliant surgeon to jail because I couldn't see past my own prejudice. How many others have I throughout the day?" He met with other judges, legal scholars, and civil rights attorneys. Each meeting was harder than the last, but he didn't shy away from the difficult conversations. Meanwhile, Dr. Washington received another surprising call. The local bar association wanted her to speak at their upcoming conference. About her experience, she sat in her office thinking about the request. "I'm a surgeon, not a public speaker," she told her colleague Dr. James Chun over lunch. "Maybe that's Exactly why you should do it, Dr. Chin replied. You can help them see the person behind the defendant's table back in the courthouse. Sarah Chun brought Judge Sterling his afternoon coffee and found him reviewing video recordings of his past court sessions. The recording showed a pattern he had never noticed before: his different tones of voice, his body language, his rushed judgments. Your Honor, Sarah said carefully, Channel 7 News has been calling. They've heard about yourself, Rue, and want to do a story. Sterling shook his head. This isn't about publicity, Sarah, it's about fixing what I broke. He picked up another file. Look at this one. Sandra Thompson, Denny bail. For a minor infraction, single mother lost her job because of my decision. As the day wore on, more and more files revealed patterns about Judge Sterling. He made notes about every case where his bias may have influenced his judgment. The list grew, but he did not stop. Each name represented a person whose life he had impacted. By evening, his office resembled a war room. Files everywhere, sticky notes covering his walls. Sarah had stayed late to help, feeling, for the first time, that she was part of something important. We'll need to review at least 10 years of cases, he said. He wiped his eyes, which felt rather tired, then took a call from Sarah, and then we start making things right, he replied, picking up his phone to make another call. Outside his window, the sunset painted Philadelphia's skyline in shades of orange and purple. In her office at the hospital, Dr. Washington was finishing her day's work when she decided to accept the Bar Association's invitation. Change, she realized, happens one conversation at a time. The largest meeting room in the Philadelphia County Courthouse was packed. Judge Sterling stood before more than 200 people, former defendants, lawyers, community leaders, and fellow judges. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, highlighting the nervous sweat on his forehead. My name is Marcus Sterling, he began, his voice shaking slightly. For 25 years, I've served as a judge in this courthouse, and for 25 years, I've been part of the problem. He paused, looking at the faces before him. Today, that changes. In the front row, Dr. Maya Washington sat next to Sarah Chun. They watched as the judge who once ruled his courtroom with rigid authority now stood humble before the community. He had heard, we've reviewed over 3,000 of my P cases. Sterling continued, pointing to the screen behind him, showing statistics. The evidence of my bias is clear and undeniable. African-American defendants received sentences averaging 40% longer than white defendants for the same crimes. Latino defendants faced higher bail amounts. Asian Americans were more often denied. Interpreters' murmurs spread through the crowd. Some nodded in recognition of their own experiences. Others looked shocked at the numbers. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Sterling said, his voice growing stronger. Behind each case is a person whose life I affected. James Carter lost his scholarship because of my harsh sentence. Maria Gonzalez's children went into foster care because I denied her bail. David Chin's restaurant closed when I refused to consider his family circumstances. Some in the audience wiped away tears, while others sat straight-backed, faces showing years of stored pain. I can't undo the past, Sterling added, but I can work to make it right. He nodded towards a table with a cadre of lawyers. Starting immediately, we are implementing the Sterling Review Initiative. Each case where my bias played a factor in the sentencing will be reopened. We have teamed up with the Public Defender's Office and several private firms who will work pro bono in aid of our effort to vacate unjust sentences. Dr. Washington observed as several in the room leaned into one another. She recalled her morning in his courtroom. How easily she could have joined a list of lives dislocated by prejudice. The judge continued, we've also established a compensation fund. I'm selling my vacation home and contributing my own savings. It won't fix everything, but it's a start. Sarah Chin stood up and walked to the podium with more files. These had green stickers, cases already identified for immediate review. The work had already begun, but the biggest change, Sterling said, looking directly at his fellow judges, must be in how we move forward. I'm working with the Judicial Review Board to create new guidelines for checking bias and sentencing. Every judge would be made to question his or her own patterns twice a year. Some of his colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Change wasn't easy, especially for those used to being above question. After the presentation, people lined up to speak with Judge Sterling. Each had a story, a case, a memory. He listened to everyone, writing down names, case numbers, details, no more rushing through lives as if they were just numbers on a docket. Dr. Washington approached him last. That couldn't have been easy, she said, extending her hand. Sterling shook it. remembering how differently he had treated her just weeks ago. The easy path led me wrong for 25 years, doctor. It's time for the harder road. Later that afternoon, news crews gathered outside the courthouse. The story was spreading, a judge admitting bias, working to make amends, challenging the system itself. Some called it career suicide, others called it a watershed moment. In his chambers, Judge Sterling met with the first group of lawyers who would review his old cases. The work ahead was enormous, but for the first time in his career, he felt like he was truly serving justice. Dr. Washington returned to her hospital, where she found a message waiting. Other courts in other cities wanted to know more about the Sterling Initiative. Change, like a pebble thrown in water, was creating ripples. That evening, as the courthouse emptied, Sarah Chun found Judge Sterling still at his desk reviewing more files. On his wall hung a new sign written in clear letters: "Justice is not just what we do, but how we do it." The real work was just beginning. 3 months after Judge Sterling's public admission, the Philadelphia Judicial Center's main auditorium was filled to capacity. Dr. Maya Washington stood at the podium, facing an audience of judges, lawyers, and medical professionals from across the country. Medicine and justice have something important in common. She began, her voice clear and confident. In both fields, our biases can mean the difference between life and death, freedom or imprisonment. In the front row, Judge Sterling sat with Sarah Chun, both taking points out. The conference, entitled "Breaking Bias, Healthcare and Justice," was a first of its kind in bringing together professionals from both worlds to address systemic PR. 6 months ago, I was almost sent to jail for a traffic violation, Dr. Washington continued, as she showed a slide of her operating room. The same day, I had saved 2 lives through emergency surgery, but in that courtroom, none of that mattered. I wasn't seen as Dr. Washington, the neurosurgeon. I was just another face that fits someone's prejudice expectations. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Many recognized their own biases in her words. At the back of the room, Emma, Judge Sterling's granddaughter, sat with her parents, now fully recovered from her brain surgery. She watched the doctor who had saved her life teach another kind of healing the system itself. But this story isn't about one judge or one doctor. Dr. Washington said it's about the choices we make every day in the ER. I can't choose which patients deserve care based on how they look, and in a courtroom, justice must be equally blind. She clicked to the next slide, showing the results of the Sterling Initiative's first 3 months: 157 cases reviewed, 89 sentences reduced or overturned, $1.2 million in compensation distributed, 23 other judges voluntarily joining the review process. Judge Sterling stood up next, joining Dr. Washington at the podium. The man who had once commanded his courtroom with strict gravity spoke now with remarkable humility. "We found something powerful," he said. "When we own our errors and take action to correct them, people trust the system more." Over the last 3 months, court appearances have risen. People believe they will at least get a fair hearing. Sarah Chun played the second half about how they modified the normal court proceedings. Every judge was now fitted with a bias check mechanism. Case evaluations were now carried out on a monthly basis, and not yearly. Public defenders were given additional state-assigned assistants. Over lunch, Dr. Washington walked alongside Judge Sterling down the corridors of the hospital. They reached the pediatric ward, which housed a few of her young patients. "Remember what you told me that day in your chamber?" she asked. "About not being able to undo the past." Sterling nodded, watching a child in a wheelchair practice walking with a physical therapist in medicine. She continued, "We can't undo damage either, but we can help heal. We can help people move forward. That's what you're doing with the initiative." Back at the conference afternoon session, focused on practical changes, other courts shared their plans to adopt similar programs. Medical schools discussed new training to address bias, and healthcare law schools presented updated curricula. Emma joined them for the final panel, sharing her story of both sides. "A Patient Safe" by Dr. Washington. "And as the granddaughter of a judge, I learned to change. My grandfather taught me that being strong means admitting when you're wrong," she told the audience, and Dr. Washington showed me that every person deserves to be seen for who they really are. As the day ended, Dr. Washington received news that 5 more cities had requested information about starting their own bias review programs. Judge Sterling found more judges volunteering and go over their past cases in the parking lot that evening. Dr. Washington caught up with Judge Sterling as he was leaving. "We're making progress," she said, "but there's still so much work to be done." "Yes," he agreed, "but now we're doing it together. Doctors, judges, lawyers, communities, all of us learning to see each other clearly." They looked up at the hospital building, where lights glowed in patient rooms, and then at the courthouse next door, where late-working lawyers still moved through lit offices. Two places of power, of life-changing decisions slowly learning to serve everyone equally. The next day would bring more cases, more surgeries, more chances to either perpetuate bias or fight it. But now there was a path forward, and they weren't walking it alone. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning in Courtroom 304. The National Judicial Conference in Washington, D.C. was packed with over 1,000 attendees. Judge Marcus Sterling and Dr. Maya Washington were standing together backstage, preparing for their keynote speech. "Nervous, Dr." Washington asked, noticing Judge Sterling adjusting his tie for the third time. A little. He had admitted a year ago, "I was just a judge who thought he knew everything. Now I am speaking to judges from all 50 states about everything that I got wrong." Through the curtain, they could see Emma, sitting in the front row, now 17. She had become an active speaker at high schools about bias and justice. Next to her sat Sarah Chin, recently promoted to Chief Court Administrator, her new position created specifically to oversee bias prevention programs. The conference host approached the podium. "Today's speakers need no introduction. Their story inspired change within courts throughout America. Please welcome Judge Marcus Sterling and Dr. Maya Washington." As they walked onto the stage, the audience rose in a standing ovation. On screens behind them, numbers told their story. 1,247 cases reviewed and corrected. 37 states adopting similar programs. For $5 million in compensation paid, 89% decrease in disparities in sentencing in the courts participating. 1 year back drive Washington started. "I was standing before a judge, the threat of a jail sentence. Today, I stand before you as a partner in change," she said to Judge Sterling. "But it's not about just two people. It's about all the lives influenced by bias and all the lives now being influenced by reform." Judge Sterling stepped forward. "The hardest moment in any judge's life," he admitted, "is when we confess we are wrong." But he said, however hard it is, the most critical moment is when we decide to be right. They showed videos from around the country. A young man graduating college after his wrongful conviction was overturned. A grandmother opening a new business with her compensation funds. Judges and doctors collaborating to confront bias in both professions. Mid-presentation, news alerts lit up everyone's phone. The Supreme Court had just released new national guidelines for bias review in all federal courts based on the Sterling Initiative. Sarah Chin rushed backstage and handed them the news release. Dr. Washington read it aloud to the audience, her voice shaking with feeling. "The justice system needs to reflect truth at its core, that every human has value, deserves to be seen and heard and judged equitably." Following the plenary presentation, they hosted breakout sessions. Judges spoke of their experiences in putting reform into practice. Public defenders spoke of better resources. Medical professionals spoke about parallel shifts happening in healthcare. On lunch break, Emma joined them at their table. "Grandpa," she said, turning her phone towards him, "my story about you and Dr. Washington won some national high school essay contest. They want to publish it in law journals." Judge Sterling hugged his granddaughter, remembering how close he had come to losing her and how his prejudice had almost made him hurt the very person who saved her. Later that afternoon, Dr. Washington led a session on emergency room bias and surgery. "We can't choose our patients," she explained. "In justice, you can't choose who deserves fair treatment. Everyone deserves the same care, the same justice, the same respect." As the conference ended, Judge Sterling received an unexpected honor. The National Judicial College announced a new annual award, the Sterling Washington Prize for Judicial Reform, recognizing judges who work to eliminate bias in their courts. "This isn't an award for me," he said during the ceremony. "It's for every person that stood in my courtroom and didn't get the justice they deserved. It's for every judge willing to look in the mirror and change. It's for every Dr. Washington who persists, despite the barriers we put in their way." That evening, as they left the conference center, they saw a group of young law students waiting to talk to them, the next generation of judges and lawyers eager to learn from their story. "Do you ever regret that morning in court?" one student asked Dr. Washington. She looked at Judge Sterling, then at Emma, then back at the student. "That morning showed us that change is possible when we see each other clearly, when we had made our mistakes, when we work to make things right. That's when justice becomes real." As they walked into the Washington evening, they passed the Supreme Court It was a structure of words chiseled in stone. Equal justice under the law, something different now, something deeper and truer and more human than ever before. The story wasn't over, but now it belonged to everyone willing to look in the mirror and choose to change.